Hello, welcome to my next knitting book review. Today, again, I am combining two of my favorite things, knitting and books. We're looking at Vogue Knitting Weekend Knits on the go. This is a pretty compact, small little book, and most of it is text. I will say that's not my favorite way to have patterns. I do like having pictures that show you what it is you're going to be making, as well as showing some information about the techniques or sizing and that kind of stuff. So there are some diagrams, which is good, but I will say this is not my favorite knitting book that I have checked out to review. There are some hidden gems, which I definitely will cover here, and definitely some projects that I'm going to try. But let's dive in. Who would I recommend this book to? That's a tough question. I'm not actually entirely sure I would recommend this book at this point in time. I think that it is a book that has information in it that needs to be taken with a grain of salt, a few little gems, and a couple of cool projects. The things that you need to take with a grain of salt that are in the introduction, or at least the way that I read them. It's possible that the phrasing was intended differently than the way I interpreted it. The first thing to take with a grain of salt. Weekend Knits presents 21 basic yet sophisticated projects that are appropriate for knitters of any skill level. I think what they were trying to say here is there is something in this book for knitters of any skill level. All of the projects are not appropriate for knitters of any skill level. There are some intermediate and a couple more advanced projects that beginners would want to do a few projects before they dived into that one. The second thing to take with a grain of salt. Each project has been carefully designed and requires minimal shaping and finishing techniques, so you can create a portable, no-fuss design in 48 hours or less. It is definitely true that the projects in this book have been designed in such a way that there's not a lot of finishing you have to do. That is very helpful and will definitely make the project quicker. That is often one of the things that gets postponed and takes quite a bit of time, surprisingly. However, I do question this statement that things can be done in 48 hours or less. Do they mean 48 hours of straight knitting, or within a 48-hour time period doing your normal life? So there's a few patterns that I'm going to test the timing of. Item number 3 to take with a grain of salt. Maximize commuting time by fashioning a snazzy baby blanket for a weekend baby shower, or stitch up a pair of seed stitch mittens and wear them to work the next day. When they say wear them to work the next day, do they mean you can do it overnight? And if so, are they talking like a Sunday afternoon, or are they talking Thursday night, wear them Friday? I'm not sure, but that is one of the 3 patterns that I would like to test the timing of. The first pattern I want to test the timing of is on page 37. It's a ribbed hat called Hats Off. Now, hats tend to be relatively good projects for beginner knitters, and this does say that it is for a beginner knitter, and it's done with a large yarn. So I think this is a good one that might be relatively quick, and I'm curious to test how long it takes me to make it. The second pattern I want to test timing of is seed stitch mittens, Loving Hands. This is the one that in the introduction they claimed you could, well, they said knit them and wear them to work the next day. So I'm just curious about the timing of that. Plus I think they're pretty fun and I love seed stitch, so I'm excited to give these ones a try. The third pattern I want to test out the timing of is the man's weekend sweater called the Comfort Zone. This is a fun sweater where you start with a sleeve and you work all the way across the top and over to the other sleeve. I've never done a sweater that way. I think that seems pretty fun and exciting. It's definitely done with bulky yarn. And also this one is one that says it's for an intermediate knitter. I'm curious to see how long it takes. Plus, I have a client who would like to have a sweater made for them and they liked this pattern as well. so I'm going to be doing this one as a commissioned project. Stay tuned for updates on how long those 3 timed test ones take me. I'll definitely report back on that. There are 3 other really fun designs that I liked personally a lot. I don't have any babies in my life right now to make the blanket or the pullover for, but I'm going to keep them in mind for the future. But I really loved this idea of a cable belt. Teaching people to cable knit is always fun, and I love this as a good project idea of something that somebody could make and get some good practice in on cabling and have a fun finished product at the end. There's also one technique, something I have been very interested in trying out for a while, which is the right twist, which is a very small cable, just a 2-stitch switch. And they talk about how to do this using not using a cable needle. So keeping both stitches on your left needle and knitting them with your right needle before slipping them off. So I'm interested in testing that out. Has anyone else done a right twist, not using a cable needle, just knitting off of the left needle? Share any tips below and stay tuned for a video if you're also curious and want to know how to do it. All right, let's take a look at the basics section, and I'll share with you the things that I wanted to highlight as tips I think were very helpful. The first thing they talked about was sizing. Is that they said, measure a sweater that fits you well to decide which size is best for you. So instead of trying to measure yourself, you can take a sweater that you really like the way it fits, or socks or scarf or hat, any of those things, and measure that and compare it to what they are saying. So then you know that the end product is likely to fit in a similar way, which is one that you already like. Yarn substitutions. We all know I love using my stash to make things, so I'm always swapping out whatever the pattern specifically called for something I may already have. There were 2 things that I wanted to highlight from there. Be sure to consider how the fiber content on the substitute yarn will affect the comfort and ease of care of your projects. So the fiber content does have an impact on things like how soft the yarn is, how stretchy it is. So if you are making socks, for example, you will want maybe different yarn than if you're making a scarf or a hat. And the yarn that they called for and they designed it to make it, if they designed it with a specific type of yarn, using a different kind of yarn will change some of those things. I love the feel factor. So if you touch the yarn, if you're going to wear it as a hat, kind of putting it up on your head, if you're going to wear it as a scarf, putting it near your neck, seeing if you like the way it feels. That is one of the things that I like to do. And the other thing there is the care of the item. So if you're making a sweater and they called for a washable yarn and you're substituting a non-washable yarn, make sure you think about that. Is that something that you're okay with? Are you okay with not being able to put this in the washing machine? And the second thing to keep in mind if you're substituting yarn is you may need a different number of balls or skeins of yarn than they say. They have a very helpful formula that explains to you how to take the number that they said, multiply it by the number of yards or meters that yarn has per ball, then take the yarn that you're going to use, see how many meters or yards are on that ball or skein of yarn, and multiply it by, well, I guess you could do either. Multiply it by the number, see if it still works, or divide it by the number that you had before, and that will tell you the number of skeins that you need. Just be sure to round up. Even if you only needed, say, 8.2 balls of yarn, you will definitely need that 0.2 part of it. So go ahead and get the 9 balls of yarn. Gauge. That tricky friend of ours that comes up all the time. One of the things that they talked about here in the basics section is that the type of needles that you use can have an impact on your gauge. So if you're using straight needles versus double pointed or circular needles, if you're knitting flat versus in the round, if you're using metal or wooden needles, they say that can have an impact on it. So go ahead and use the needles that you are planning to for the finished product while you're doing your gauge swatch. That'll give you the most accurate information about how those needles and that yarn are going to work together for your finished product. Sewing. If we're making something that is not just a flat piece of fabric like a scarf or a washcloth, then sewing is probably going to be a part of what you're doing. If you're making a bag, you might be joining the sides together. If you're making a sweater, you'll be sewing sleeves on or sides. The tip they had here I thought was a really great one. When using a very bulky or highly textured yarn, it is sometimes easier to seam pieces together with a finer, flat yarn. Just be sure to use one that matches closely. So if you're using, say, a white to make your sweater, don't use a hot pink to sew it together, or that might be pretty visible. But if you're using a thinner yarn, it'll make the seaming come together with less of a bulge, and also will just make it easier to thread and pull your yarn in and out of the stitches, more so than a really thick yarn would. All right, there's my take on weekend knits from Vogue Knitting on the go. Did you already know all of those tips that I shared? Which ones were new to you? Share those in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you want to show some further support or get information about future videos. And of course, happy knitting!